you, pre-recorded from Casa de Regis in Culver City, California, it's the Reggie N Regis Podcast!
Welcome to episode 3 of the Reggie N Regis Podcast. I am your host, Reggie Bowman. To my left is my compadre, Regis.
Yes, that's Regis, one name, like Madonna or Cher, but younger and way less talented.
Today we're going to try something different. We're basically, before I start with that, I should say, I hope everybody out there is basically continuing to hold their heads up, continuing to be safe in this kind of rough time that we're going through right now with the coronavirus, obviously. Just better days are ahead, and I just hope everybody out there is just kind of doing the right things, staying quarantined, basically social distance and whatnot.
Yeah, because not only does it affect, our lives as we're living them day by day, but it also affects the world of sports that this podcast was constructed to be around. Our goal when we started the show was to be timely and relevant based on what was currently going on. But, of course, given these unorthodox times we're in, we kind of had to shift gears a little bit. And this would have been a great week to go over what was going on in the current world. We're recording this on March 28th, and there would have been no dearth of things for us to cover. For example, we would have had MLB opening day 2 days ago. We would have had the Elite Eight of the NCAA tournament going on literally as we're recording this, and we could have broken down 3 rounds of the NCAA tournament and have that be its own show. What else would we have had going on?
You pretty much covered all of it. It feels weird even 2 days after the fact that opening day baseball didn't happen. We don't have the NCAA tournament to talk about. And basically the stretch run of the NBA and NHL regular season games aren't happening. But, in this, just in kind of all aspects, we're just trying to be a little creative right now. I'm pretty excited about this particular podcast because this was our initial idea when we first met like last summer. And basically it's kind of what brought us together, obviously. And we're just going to take a stroll down memory lane. Obviously most of the big companies, ESPN and Fox Sports, and they've all been kind of doing like a lot of retro games. So we thought it'd be a lot of fun if we did the same thing.
We're going to do something a little bit different than we've done so far. But before we get into what it is, Reggie, let me ask you something. Did you watch a lot of professional wrestling back in the 90s?
Yes, I did.
And so did a lot of other people. And no, we're not going to break down anything professional wrestling-wise. We're not that desperate. But there's this mortgage banker in Huntsville, Alabama. His name's Conrad Thompson. He has tons of connections in the professional wrestling industry. And in recent years, he started hosting a series of podcasts with some heavy hitters from that era, both from in front of and behind the camera. And on each of their episodes, what they'll do is they'll take a topic such as someone's career or an event like a WrestleMania or something like that, and they'll break that down in long form. And we figured we could adapt that to the sports world, to some of these classic games that, ESPN and Fox Sports and all of them are starting to show.
Yeah, and our particular, topic today is going to be the 2003 National Championship game between the University of Miami and the Ohio State University.
The Ohio State Buckeyes? You've reserved the right to say the word "the"?
Oh, I apologize. The Ohio State Buckeyes.
We're very protective about that, us Ohio natives. But yeah, it was a classic game, and many people tend to overlook it because it happened so shortly prior to that 2006 Rose Bowl, which followed the 2005 season between Texas and USC, which many consider, at least in the modern era, to be maybe the greatest college football game of all time. But this game was a classic for many reasons as well. One, because it featured a lot of good offense and a lot of good defensive play. It featured a lot of future stars that would go on to prolific NFL careers, and some people that maybe didn't pan out so well. But again, going back to why we would have chosen this, we were actually going to do this as our pilot episode, basically because of our backgrounds.
Exactly. Myself, obviously living in Miami for 18 years, you growing up in the state of Ohio, it just made sense for us to do that. And I don't know if we were completely serious about it at the time. I mean, it was like 2 guys in a bar on Sunday afternoon, but very glad it came together, and it's been a lot of fun. With that said, one thing about this particular game, and having not seen it in such a very long time, I forgot just how great of a game it was. Everybody always talks about, obviously, the controversial call, just kind of like the overtime and the result of it. But I love a good defensive game. And one of the great things about this particular game is the fact that it wasn't just classic shootout, like back and forth action. It was just like, it had a lot of momentum swings, a lot of plays that you would never, ever see, like just in general aspects of just football.
And it had a lot of people making mistakes too.
Yeah. And it was just like, it's just, how they say sometimes like just preparation and luck. I mean, you talk about the amount of luck that came into this game just on both sides.
Ain't that the truth?
Yeah. And so with that being said, heading into that matchup, you had the 34 game winning streak for the University of Miami. Obviously winning the national championship the year prior, having arguably the greatest team of all time.
Yeah. One thing that I think is very different between the college football landscape as we head into 2020 versus where we were in this era is that Miami unquestionably was the best program in college football at this time.
Without a doubt.
And you could argue that they could have been playing for their third straight national title because in 2000, they lose early in the season to Washington. And because of the BCS and its convoluted computer formula, it pitted Oklahoma and Florida State in that Orange Bowl following that season. And then Miami goes up to New Orleans and just slaughters the Florida Gators. And again, Miami lost a lot of talent following 2001 with guys like Clinton Portis and Jeremy Shockey getting drafted into the NFL, but they still had a lot of talent left, and they were a prohibitive favorite going into the 2002 season.
Yeah, let's also not forget Frank Gore was actually injured that year. He had supplanted Willis McGahee as the lead tailback going into that season, but had an ACL injury. Funny thing about that is, I guess he recovered in time prior to the game, and on the scout team for the matchup, he was actually portraying Maurice Clarett in the scout team.
And as we'll go into later, Maurice Clarett was the unquestioned star of the Buckeyes offense going into this game against Miami as a true freshman, mind you. And Miami actually did end up having a really good season. Of course, they went undefeated against a cakewalk Big East, but it wasn't always sunshine and roses for them.
No, they had I wouldn't say they stumbled, but I remember one particular game against Rutgers, they went 0-7 in the conference.
1-11 overall.
Yeah, they were actually trailing heading into the fourth quarter, and they also had a bit of a battle against Pittsburgh. I think they were ranked number 18th in the nation at that time. They had Larry Fitzgerald. Miami had control of the game, but they just, obviously it was kind of like it was too close for comfort. Is my point. Which your Ohio State 2002 national champion had a bunch of those going into the season.
Yeah, we should note that Miami was still an 11.5-point favorite going into this game. I think a lot of that does go back to the 2000 and 2001 seasons and the fact that they were undefeated through, admittedly, a very weak Big East in 2002. But Ohio State in 2002 was the little team that could, which, again, if you look at college football, where we are going into the 2020 season, imagining Ohio State as anything but a dominant national power that's a perennial championship contender every year is almost unfathomable.
Yeah, it was pretty impressive. That was Jim Tressel's second year.
It was, and the reason it was Jim Tressel's second year was because in the late 90s, the program began to stumble. Right, it had been several years since they'd had their big names like Eddie George and Andy Katzenmoyer and a lot of those guys who contributed to those mid-90s teams that finished number 2 in 96 and was going to be a national title contender in 98 before they stumbled against Michigan. But then the team falls apart. They miss out on a bowl game in 1999. They go to the Outback Bowl in 2000, lose to South Carolina. John Cooper gets fired. Jim Tressel comes in. They have another year where they go to the Outback Bowl and then again lose to South Carolina following 2001. So it wasn't really thought of that Ohio State was going to be a major contender. Also, in the Big Ten, Michigan had kind of become the dominant program at the time. They had beaten Ohio State pretty much throughout the 90s, except for 1994. And even though Ohio State pulled what was considered a major upset in 2001, Michigan was still considered the major contender, right? Because they'd had Charles Woodson, who went on to an NFL Hall of Fame career. They had the A-Train Anthony Thomas, which there's nobody else you would want to kill the clock as a running back. They had Drew Henson, who was a good quarterback. And then they had some other quarterback, got drafted in the 6th round, eventually wound up with Tampa Bay. Seems like his career was pretty unglamorous.
Yeah, whatever happened to that guy anyway. And just to give you some feedback, I should say a little history on Miami. Obviously, they went into probation from 95 to 97. They had hired Butch Davis, who, basically, it was kind of Butch Davis had been there with Jimmy Johnson through the golden years of UM,
right?
And to
even
have
under Erickson,
right, and yes, and then bringing him back from the Dallas Cowboys, they struggled obviously for 2 years, but in '98 you saw a bit of you saw the culture being brought back as far as just recruiting wise, the players that they had Adrian James, they had Reggie Wayne.
Game against UCLA.
Right. They had Santana Moss. They had Najee Davenport. And basically using that momentum to head to the 99 season. And Butch Davis had just a home run of a recruiting class. Clinton Portis, Vernon Carey, Ken Dorsey. Guys who were relevant and obviously continue to just bring the program back to light. And obviously he left in 2001 to become the head coach of the Cleveland Browns. But he left the program in great hands with Larry Coker, who was actually in his first year as well, the same year Tressel was. So that's a kind of a I just kind of thought of that right now. It's just like, oh, hey, it's funny how one program just kind of elevated and one program just sank to the bottom after this game.
And Larry Coker would go on to a prolific career, founding and being the first head coach of the University of Texas San Antonio Roadrunners.
Yeah. I mean, I'm surprised he still has a job, but
they beat Arizona once.
Yeah. So with that being said, heading into the game, as Regis mentioned, Miami was an 11.5 point favorite. I personally went into it thinking, and I watched a few Ohio State games, this is going to be a cakewalk. I didn't think at all like just Ohio State had any chance whatsoever. I saw them get by the skin of their teeth against teams like Purdue, and they struggled against a team. Well, not struggled, but they barely won against teams like Illinois. They went life and death against Michigan on the final game of the regular season.
Yeah, they were actually losing at halftime to Michigan. The Illinois game was in OT. Penn State and Wisconsin were less than 1-score wins. Purdue had to win that one by a play that they call the Holy Buckeye, which Krenzel hits a touchdown on the last play of the game. They even went down to Cincinnati, who was in Conference USA at the time, and they only win that one 23-19.
Yeah, and again, I thought this was going to be just an easy game. Miami, even with the depleted talent that they had lost the year prior, I should say, the NFL draft, but they still had more than enough to just get the job done. Ohio State did have this freshman running back. What was his name?
A guy by the name of Maurice Clarett.
Yeah.
And if you ask me, he might be one of the major reasons why this Ohio State team was 13-0 instead of maybe 8-5 or 9-4, like they could have been going into this game. So Maurice Clarett grew up in the Youngstown area, in the shadow of Jim Tressel, who up until 2000 was the head coach at Youngstown State, won 4 1AA, now FCS national titles there. And he graduated in 2002. He actually showed up early for spring practice that year. Clarett brings him on after what he had seen Clarett do at Austintown Fitch and Warren Harding High Schools, and he wins the starting job going into the season. So needless to say, being an Ohio State running back in the run-heavy Big Ten, that was a lot of pressure to put on him.
Little known fact, Maurice Clarett actually was about the same time as LeBron James, and I remember hearing about LeBron James in 2002, cover of Sports Illustrated, the chosen one. But in the state of Ohio, at least, Maurice Clarett, is a fact that he was just as big as LeBron?
I'll put it this way. I was a senior in high school when this season and this game took place, right? And, I grew up outside of Akron, in the shadow of LeBron. He'd had the Sports Illustrated cover earlier in the year. and was already looked at as likely going number one in the next year's NBA draft. But I will say, as of the time this game took place, Maurice Clarett was probably even a slightly bigger star than LeBron James was at this time. Obviously, those paths would diverge after this game took place. But yeah, when you're the starting tailback of an undefeated Ohio State team that's playing in a national championship game, and you're the impetus of why the team is scoring so much, you are going to be basically a statewide celebrity, at least in the state of Ohio, and at least be well known throughout the college football landscape.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting to hear about that. And actually, I remember how big of a star Clarett was. I remember watching his first game against Cincinnati and thinking, oh, okay, you know, they're comparing this guy to like Archie Griffin, Eddie George. He's going to be like the next great Ohio State back. And I remember thinking like, okay, you know, he seems pretty good. He's pretty talented. But obviously, as things would follow prior to the end of this championship game, obviously it was a slow but, you know, a downhill spiral for him then.
Yeah, he ended up going on academic probation the next year prior to the 2003 season, ends up missing the entire year. Ohio State still goes into the Michigan game ranked number 5 that following year. But then in the 2004 offseason, he tries to mount a legal challenge against the NFL's longstanding rule that anyone coming into the draft has to be at least 3 years removed from high school in order to be eligible to be selected. And while he did have a decent legal strategy, the case was contested in the Southern District of New York, which is where the NFL's office is, which is a very business-friendly district, and the NFL has a lot of pull. So that challenge ended up being unsuccessful. He does end up being drafted in 2005 in the 3rd round by the Broncos. He signs a contract that's laden with incentives and has very little guaranteed money. He ends up being cut. His football career ends up in a downward spiral. I think he was in the United Football League for a second or something like that. But then he has massive legal troubles based on a high-speed chase that he led police on when he had guns and a shitload of vodka in his vehicle, did some time in prison, and then became a motivational speaker. Yeah,
and I'm glad he's been able to turn his life around, at least from what we've seen. You know what was funny, too, about going back to 2002, 2003-ish, it's funny how you look at the college football landscape, how irrelevant the SEC was. Yeah. I mean, like, if you think about it now, especially, I guess, younger college football fans who just think everything's all about Alabama and LSU. And, I mean, the SEC at that time was just straight garbage.
Yeah, they were like the Pac-12 of today.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good comparison.
Yeah, because... Right, even the Pac-12 had good teams. You know, Oregon was coming up. Washington and Oregon State were good. You know, Big Ten had come back with OSU being good. Michigan, who was pretty consistent at this time. Of course, we talked about Miami. Florida State was representing the ACC well and had been in the national championship game a couple of the years prior. The SEC was nothing. You know, Florida was still trying to figure out who it was after Steve Spurrier.
Yeah, the Ron Zook era. Yeah, I remember that. Actually, he was the one that drafted Chris Leak and kind of set the wheels in motion. I would always kind of, when I thought about Urban Meyer's first national championship against your beloved Ohio State in 06.
Yep, I remember that one.
And it was a combination of, that was the proper way to do it. See, once Butch Davis left and gave the keys to Larry Coker basically drove that Ferrari into the wall at some point and basically could never get it repaired. Whereas, you know, a guy like Urban Meyer was able to use some of Ron Zook's players, recruit some of his guys, obviously somebody like Reggie Nelson and Tim Tebow.
And the penalties and guys like that.
Yeah, exactly. And kind of keep that momentum going into more national championships later on.
But even Alabama back then was dealing with academic probation scandals. LSU was a year away from Les Miles really putting his mark on that on that program when they would share the national title the following year. But yeah, from 1999 to 2002, the SEC was an afterthought in college football, and that is just how polarizingly different that era was from this one, even though a lot of the big name programs were still the same.
You know what? Also, a fun fact too is you think about back to that watching the games, and you see some of the commercials that were on during the particular coverage of the games, and you think
we'll get to one later.
Right? It kind of took me back to a mindset of what that world was like back then. You had the 8 Mile was in the theaters, and trucker hats were like the popular thing, and throwback jerseys, NBA throwback jerseys, I should say, and.
And Justin Timberlake had just released his debut album.
Yeah.
The world had yet to hear of Paris Hilton and Kim Kardashian. And I remember living in that time and everyone thinking, oh, the world's going to shit. Is like, oh, you have no idea.
With that being said, we're going to basically, I guess we're going to start our coverage of the 2003 Fiesta Bowl National Championship game. And, wow, again, I'm very pumped up about this because it's been a while since I'd seen the game again. And just to kind of relive some of those moments and just kind of, I don't know, I had that kind of nostalgic feeling. I just remember watching it in my couch and just thinking like, oh, Miami's got this. And to realize, oh, wow, this is not going to be the cakewalk I thought it would be.
So let me ask you this. Where were you when you watched this game the first time when it happened live?
I was still living at home. I was in my parents' couch in Miami, Florida, I should say. And it was, I remember just being very hyped up and just kind of just thinking like, I had some, some friends that lived above me, and they had kind of like a party, which they didn't invite me, which I don't know why. But I could hear them just jumping just all over the floors, just getting excited and hyped up for the game.
Yeah, and I was, like I said, a senior in high school. There was about 30 of us. We were in my friend's parents' house basement, and it was like me and about maybe like 20 other of us football players, and there was maybe like 10 or 15 girls or so with us. And I bet you're listening thinking, oh, this guy sounds like the type of guy who went to a private high school full of douchebags. I'm like, well, I did go to a private high school full of douchebags. I was one of them, and I was hanging out with about 30 more of them watching this game.
Wow. Also, talk about nostalgia. Again, just some of the things that you forget. This game was broadcasted by undoubtedly the greatest voice of all time for college football history in Mr. Keith Jackson.
Talk about somebody we all miss. Rest in peace, buddy. He was alongside Dan Fouts in this game, and Keith Jackson was such a good broadcaster. He could make any analyst he was working with sound like he really knew what he was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's just some of the calls that he made in the game and just that classic voice. I mean, we all remember, some of his legendary calls, I'm sorry to bring it up, but the Desmond Howard return against Michigan in 91.
Really?
His one that you might like, the Cordell Stewart Hail Mary to beat Michigan.
That was nice.
Incredible. That was just to kind of hear that voice again. I don't recall actually when his last game was broadcast. Just something we'd have to look up. But
no, his last game was the 2005 Rose Bowl against the Texas USC game.
What a way to go out. I mean, wow. So that's, just hearing that voice again was just amazing. And it definitely brought the game up to a certain level.
And we'll be playing some clips from the audio broadcast of the game as we go along in this podcast. But an interesting fact about this game is it took place from Sun Devil Stadium in Tempe, Arizona, on the campus of that perpetual Mardi Gras known as Arizona State University. And this is probably going to be the last time a national championship game will ever be held on an on-campus stadium, because, with the way money works in college football nowadays, it's all in these, huge NFL stadiums and things like that. Actually, the next time that the rotation would go through the Phoenix area for the BCS and eventually the CFP was the 2006 season, the first year that University of Phoenix Stadium was open. Ohio State was in that national championship game as well, but that one didn't go anywhere near as well for them as it did for the 2002 team.
Yeah, and just to hit on again, just the amount of talent that was on the field that night. When you talk about Ohio State, Miami, I mean, just speaking of Ohio State first, you had Will Smith, rest in peace, Will Smith, who unfortunately passed away in 2016. You had Mike Doss, three-time All-American, who I think he won a Super Bowl with the Indianapolis Colts. You had Chris Gamble.
He was basically a poor man's Charles Woodson. He primarily played defense, played a lot of receiver too, and did some kick and punt returning.
You had a very young A.J. Hawk.
Yeah, he wasn't a starter in this game. He was a true freshman from Centerville, Ohio. He ended up replacing C. Grant, who was limited going into that game. Of course, C. Grant ends up making a huge impact on the final play of the game that we'll get to later. But A.J. Hawk, who would go on to a prolific NFL career and very famously drilled 2 quins on the same day.
Okay. We had Nick Mangold. You had even the defensive coordinator, Mark D'Antoni.
Mark D'Antonio.
Mark D'Antonio.
Yeah, you're thinking Mike D'Antoni, ex-coach of the Knicks. I know you want to forget that one. So after the following season, he would go on to take the head coaching job at the University of Cincinnati, which in 2002, as we mentioned, almost beat the Buckeyes. Ends up laying the groundwork for Brian Kelly to turn that program around. And then in 2007, takes the Michigan State job that he would hold up until about a month or two ago. And interesting fact, he won 11 games in five seasons out of a 6-season stretch while at Michigan State, which you wouldn't have thought they were that good.
Yeah, and obviously the loaded Miami team who had lost, again, a bunch of first-round picks in the 2002 NFL draft, but they still had Jonathan Vilma, Sean Taylor, another, obviously, rest in peace, Sean Taylor, Antrell Roll. They had McGahee, Willis McGahee, Kellen Winslow Jr., Andre Johnson, Roscoe Parrish. And unfortunately, even though he was still on the team, but he didn't play in the game, was Frank Gore, who's still somehow relevant to this day.
Yeah, a comparison I like to make for Miami is that they were the Can't Hardly Wait of college football programs. Of course, Can't Hardly Wait was a movie that came out in 1998 that featured a plethora of young actors that would go on to very prolific careers. And if you haven't seen it, 1998, Jennifer Love Hewitt alone is worth the price of admission. But that Miami team had a lot of players that would go on to either prolific college or even more prolific NFL careers. And there's a few guys on the...
it's kind of a Bill Simmons moment for you, isn't it, Reg?
Hey, you're the one who listens to his podcasts. But hey, your offense also had future Cleveland Browns legend Ken Dorsey.
Yeah, Ken Dorsey. Ken Dorsey, I tend to, when I think about Ken Dorsey's career in Miami, he falls more in line of these kind of tweener guys like Steve Walsh and Craig Erickson. And, he's the prototypical quarterback of the system and the players around you make you look better than you actually are, you know? Again, and it's not a knock on Ken Dorsey. He was what he was, but I mean, he was a fierce competitor. Obviously, he's the greatest quarterback in, my university, my favorite university's team ever. So, but I think this game kind of exposed him for what he actually was in retrospect.
Yeah, and we'll get to how that happened, some of that later. And we didn't get to OSU's offense. They had a couple other good players, too. They had Michael Jenkins, who went on to a good NFL career. And they had a freshman guard on their offensive line, Rob Sims, who's actually from my hometown of Macedonia, Ohio, who ended up playing a bunch of years for the Seahawks and the Lions. So before we get into the actual game itself, we found this YouTube video that has pretty much a real-time broadcast of the game itself. Now, per legal restrictions, we obviously can't import the video clips of the game as they were uploaded to YouTube. But if you stick Miami, Ohio State 2003 in your search engine, and if you find one toward the top of the results, that's approximately 3 hours and 4 minutes long. That's the video on which the timestamps that we reference for all the major plays in this game will take place along with that if you would like to watch along.
Yeah. And basically, I guess with that being said, let's start talking about the game. The one thing, this is kind of like a game of two halves. And I know that's kind of a cliched reference, but really, like, the first half is just kind of really just all about nothing. I mean, you look at the powerful Miami offense, basically only having 7 points going into halftime.
Yeah, Miami actually was the first team to score. With 4:09 left in the first quarter, Dorsey hits a 25-yard TD to Roscoe Parrish, who in multiple ways has a big impact on the second half of this game.
Yeah, and then, I mean, it was kind of a sloppy play game. I think Dorsey had like 2 interceptions. Krenzel had a pick to Sean Taylor. And then basically Dorsey throws another pick back to Dustin Fox. It was kind of like, I think at the time, it was just, to me, it's just like, what the hell's going on? Like, why aren't we like just killing this team? Where's Willis McGahee? Where's Andre Johnson? Where's our guys? Like, what are we doing? We should be just crushing this team. And again, that's just me speaking as a fan at that time.
Well, I mean, the Buckeyes weren't playing particularly well either. As we'll get to later, Clarett didn't have a very good statistical game at all, even at the end of everything. But yeah, in the second quarter, Krenzel scores on a 4th and 1 from the 2 to tie it up at 7. And then on the very next series, Ken Dorsey gets sacked, fumbles, and OSU recovers on the 14. Clarett scores on a 7-yard run. Miami kneels on it after that kickoff, and at halftime, it's 14-7 Buckeyes, and neither team is playing particularly well. Like, I remember being a Buckeyes fan watching this game. We were up 14-7 on Miami, and we were thinking, okay, they're going to have some halftime speech, the other shoe's going to drop, and then the second half is going to be some kind of blowout, and it's pretty much going to be all she wrote from there. Yeah,
and again, it really didn't start to turn into Miami's favor until like maybe late third quarter.
But before we get to the late third quarter, this is the first of the big plays that we're going to want to get to. If you're following along on the YouTube video, it is at the 1 hour 17:54 second mark. OSU is up 14-7. It's 1st and 10 Buckeyes with 10:50 left to go in the third quarter. And we will go ahead and play the audio clip of Keith Jackson calling that now.
Krenzel keeps it, throws it to the end zone, and it is picked off. Picked off by Sean Taylor. He threw it right to him. He had double coverage on his intended receiver and no chance to get it there, and Clarett took it away from him.
Yes, he did, Keith. Maurice Clarett with the play of the game, perhaps.
Again, looking back on that particular, I remember seeing it live, obviously, and thinking, I've never seen that happen before. I mean, literally throwing a interception in the end zone, having our best defensive player, maybe our best overall player, just kind of return it. And my first instinct was, he's going to take it back. I mean, he's basically if he doesn't take it back, he's going to get us at least past the 50-yard line. And when I saw Clarett come in there and basically just kind of grab it, you couldn't really tell if he'd taken the ball away, just tackled him. And to see the replay of that, I mean, how many times can you actually say that's happened that at least you've witnessed?
In terms of the running back actually stealing the ball back without it hitting the ground.
Any defensive player stealing it back, period. I mean, normally it's a tackle. It might even be a fumble that goes out of bounds, or that might even get covered, but it's basically just takes it away from him, just rips it away from him. And I'm like, where did Clarett come from, number one? And again, it's just one of those plays that you just never see that happens.
Well, you have to take a look at the camera angles on this too, right? Sean Taylor reads this pass absolutely perfectly. And we would see a lot of this from Sean Taylor in the coming years, both in his final year at Miami and in the NFL. In fact, this is just my opinion, but when he was unfortunately gunned down in November of 2007, I would say he was easily a top 3 defensive player in the league, and maybe at that time, maybe the best defensive player in the league.
His trajectory was there. I mean, he was definitely one of the most feared. I mean, he's basically injured Drew Brees in a Pro Bowl. I mean, that's how the level of intensity. I mean, you talk about a 6'3", what was he, maybe 230, 35-pound strong safety in the NFL. I mean,
who could blaze past anybody.
Right. Just a complete intimidation on all levels. And to have that, again, thinking back on that particular play, just how that Clarett strip changed the momentum back to Ohio State.
Well, there's 2 things to break down here, right? Sean Taylor was coming all the way from the end zone. Clarett was near the backfield. right? So he actually had an angle to which he could pursue Sean Taylor and at least try to make a tackle, if not try to force the ball out. And the fact that he is able to actually take it out of his hands, again, without it hitting the ground, without having a scramble pursue. There's also one other thing that if you watch the video on this, we're not sure if Claret actually had possession. We're not sure if he actually landed in bounds. Like today, that would be reviewed, and who knows if that would have been overturned. On the play immediately preceding this one, there was a 57-yard pass play to Chris Gamble that was very close to being a fumble. That could have been reviewed, rendering this play moot. And one thing we're going to see as time goes along is that there's a lot of very questionable calls and non-calls that affect this game and affect these programs in the way that it did.
Yeah, be that as it may, the play stood, and I guess it brings us to the heart of the game, the meat of the game, the fourth quarter and the 2 overtimes, which is where that kind of back and forth momentum basically to me that's when the game started. If you ever look at a great boxing match, especially with two guys who just throw hands, it's basically at some point in time a fight's gonna break out. Enough of this kind of like jabbing and pity patting and all that stuff.
And trying to last 15 rounds. At some point, you're trying to kill the other guy.
Exactly. And even though, again, it was not a high scoring kind of your classic shootout game, you did see both teams kind of starting to find their niche, starting to find their groove as far as just guys just kind of stepping up. Kellen Winslow was easily the best player on that Miami team, especially in the second half, obviously, with just the amount of weapons that they have. But Winslow just made catch after catch and clutch catches, too.
Yeah, after Claret recovered that fumble, OSU would go on to score a field goal, but Miami would score a touchdown late in the third quarter to where in the fourth, it's now OSU 17, Miami 14. And again, Kellen Winslow is showing some of the flashes of brilliance he would go on to do throughout the rest of college and with the Cleveland Browns. Yes, I just used flashes of brilliance and Cleveland Browns in the same sentence. I know how oxymoronic that sounds.
That was actually Willis McGahee who scored that touchdown. It was a 10-yard, I guess it was a 10-yard touchdown that brought Miami up to 14 points, 14-17, as you mentioned. And McGahee, I was waiting for him to just kind of have that big game and just have that big run, I should say. Not a big game, but just... once he kind of broke that open and he scored that touchdown, I was just like, okay, now, the floodgates are open. Now he's going to basically just kind of dominate the rest of this game because he was our best player basically the entire season.
Yeah, but if you fast forward on the YouTube video to the 1:48:53 mark, we're about to show a play that shows that's very much not the case. It's 17-14 Buckeyes. It's 3rd and 10 Miami, 11:48 left in the fourth quarter, and we'll just play the audio clip.
Dorsey setting up a screen. They bust up the screen. They bust up everything. Will Allen coming like a truck. Takes on McGahee and takes him down. And trainers are on the field in a hurry for Miami. McGahee is down.
About as gruesome of an injury as you will ever see on a football field. I would advise you, if you do watch it on YouTube, I just hope you don't have a squeamish stomach because it's pretty bad.
Yeah, the clip we just played was from the actual play as it took place live. The camera angle they showed just kind of showed Will Allen getting a low hit on him and him going down. But they showed some replays afterwards, which were, I'll put it this way, me and the rest of the guys in the room where we were watching it, we were all like dry heaving, ready to puke. Of course, the girls were watching and were like, oh, that doesn't look so bad. But us guys were like, oh my God, a knee should not bend in the way that it did. So after that, it turns out that on that play, Willis McGahee had torn 3 of the 4 ligaments in his knee, the ACL, the MCL, and the PCL, with only the LCL remaining intact. However, it didn't exactly end up ending his career like many thought it would have.
Yeah, he actually was the, the 23rd pick by the Buffalo Bills in the 2003 NFL draft. He's still the first running back taken. Which is, I can remember him leading up to the draft. He was like doing workouts. I was like, how is this guy, how is he even able to walk, more or less just doing drills? I mean, Drew Rosenhaus was working magic apparently back then. But I remember for that particular game just feeling sorry for him because he'd had such a great year. He ran over 1,700 yards. He had 28 touchdowns or 27 touchdowns. And, anytime when you see an injury like that happen, at least speaking for myself, I take myself out of the moment as far as being a fan and just actually feeling compassion just for that particular player. I mean, it could have been somebody on Ohio State, and I would have felt bad.
Exactly. I will say, as a Buckeyes fan and as a fan of the game, it went away from, at least we don't have to worry about McGahee anymore. It's like, wow, I hope he ends up being all right. And it turns out he actually did end up being all right. He ended up going on to a 10-year NFL career, largely as a touchdown vulture. So he ended up pissing off a lot of fantasy football fans and a lot of starting running backs and their agents.
Yeah, he played 10 years. I think he rushed over 8,000 yards. So, I mean, he had a very good career. Miami running backs, a little bit underrated. I mean, Frank Gore, 15,000 yards. Edgerrin James going to the Hall of Fame, 12,000 yards. Clinton Portis, I believe he has 9,000 yards. And McGahee, I mean, yeah, I'm sorry, I just had to throw that in there.
Well, it is kind of interesting. Going back, one point we didn't make earlier is that Frank Gore, well, we did make the point that Frank Gore played Maurice Clarett in the scout team, but when they interviewed him prior to the game, he said something very interesting.
Yeah, he actually said they're comparing. Well, I'm portraying Maurice Clarett, but I'm actually better than Maurice Clarett, which I was just like, oh, okay. And obviously, he kind of proved that to be true going forward.
Yeah, considering it's 2020 and that guy is still playing professional football.
What is he, like 50 years old now?
He's older than me. But
football years.
Oh, football years. He's like 112.
Yeah, there you go. And certainly a Hall of Famer.
I think he deserves to get in. I'm sure there are going to be people that say he's like, oh, he's only getting in because of longevity. I'm like, you try playing running back for 15 years.
Yeah, look, 15,000 yards, he's third all time. With that being said, after McGahee goes down, Miami still puts, they still have some momentum going into the fourth quarter. And they're driving down the field at I think it was at the 5:13 mark. Ken Dorsey hits Roscoe Parrish. I think it was kind of like a slant going like in the middle of the field. Parrish is about to take off, and then Will Allen tackles him, and Parrish fumbles the ball. And I remember just being devastated, just thinking like, oh my God, like what? Why?
Yeah, and at this time of the game, again, we're back to the point where both offenses are kind of looking for a spark, because right after the McGahee injury, Todd Severs misses a 54-yard field goal, and then Nugent misses a 42-yard field goal a few minutes later. So, it's still 17-14 Buckeyes, but neither team feels like they're safe, right? Because Miami's trying to get some offense going. The Buckeyes have kind of stalled out. And Roscoe Parrish gives Miami hope, but then
I was just about to mention that how Miami's defense was able to kind of like obviously prevent Ohio State from doing anything else. And Roscoe Parrish has a bit of redemption on his side. Basically returns the punt. What was it, like about maybe 40, 50 yards?
Well, yeah, we'll get to that in a second. So after Parrish fumbles in OSU territory, OSU gets the ball back. They have to punt after a very controversial incompletion on 3rd and 6 to Chris Gamble. Again, this is another example to where if this game was played, say, in 2019, 2020, things could have gone very differently, because this could have been very easily reviewable. On this play, it's at 2:07:55 on the YouTube video, if you want to follow along with us. We don't have an audio clip of it, but he appears to have been in bounds. And if he does make that catch, and it is ruled a catch with a first down, right, OSU has the ball with 2:19 left with a first down, and Miami on defense only has one timeout. And also, Chris Gamble was held on the play before he even made the catch, but that wasn't called as well. Again, showing the differences between the game back then and the game today. But Miami actually catches a break there, forcing OSU to punt, and then we get to the Roscoe Parrish return, like you mentioned.
Right, and that was at the 2:11 mark. Roscoe Parrish, who returned it about 50 yards to the Ohio State 26-yard line, and which actually sets up Miami's kicker for a game-tying field goal.
Well, also on the Parrish return, he was aided by a block in the back call that wasn't called, but we aren't going to get into that or anything. Actually, yeah, so in another example of just how different the world was in 2002 and 2003 as compared to now, in the commercial break after Miami's timeout for the game-tying field goal attempt and before the attempt itself, ABC runs its commercials, and at the 2:12:23 mark on your YouTube video, they run what is a now iconic Miller Lite commercial in which two lovely young ladies...
Regis, nobody cares about a commercial from 2003.
Trust me, once I describe this, I'm sure some of our listeners will. So these two lovely young ladies debate in very late 90s, early 2000s fashion whether Miller Lite has great taste or is less filling. And without giving too much away, it was done in a way that can not be replicated in the world today. But feel free to watch it. I watched it about 8 different times prepping for this podcast. It is truly, truly an excellent piece of commercially driven cinematic filmmaking.
Are you finished? Can we get back to the game, please?
Oh, okay, now I'm finished.
Okay. No, I'm waiting on you. Are you sure you're done? Can we get back to the game? I mean, is there any other commercials you want to run off the top of your head that happened like 17, 18 years ago?
None like that.
Okay.
So anyway, after we come back, OSU ices the kicker, and if you want to head in the game to the 2:16:14 mark, we actually have an audio clip of the game-tying attempt itself. Again, the score is 17-14, 3 seconds left, and here's the clip.
Has to be this time. Has to be. From 40 yards. Chris Harvey snaps. Capshaw holds. But we're going to overtime.
Oh, yeah. Overtime indeed. Now it's anybody's game. And
the Buckeyes fans amongst us are thinking, oh, shit, it's overtime.
Yeah. I remember feeling once Todd Severs hit that kick, I was just thinking like, okay, we got this. Our talent, our experience is just going to get us through. And, I felt like kind of like Ohio State would wilt under that pressure.
So Miami gets the ball first in overtime, and given by what I saw from the OSU defense in that first overtime period, it sure looked like they would wilt under the pressure because Miami's offense moved the 25 yards pretty efficiently. Yeah,
Dorsey was able to connect with Andre Johnson for a 9-yard catch. Jared Payton had an 8-yard run. And then, again, the best player on our particular team in the second half, Kellen Winslow, Dorsey was able to connect with him for a 7-yard touchdown pass. So the thing I loved about this particular touchdown pass is how Winslow just kind of like pushes the ref out of the way. If you watch the clip of that on YouTube, it's actually pretty funny. And basically, we were able to, again, momentum is a word that I use a lot in this particular podcast because this is just how this game went. And I felt like Miami was able to get that momentum back. Pass interference was called on that particular play, but obviously it was declined. And
the Buckeye fans are starting to think we're playing the Zebras too.
Yeah,
like Seahawks against the Steelers, Super Bowl 40 style.
Well, trust me. Look, every fan thinks the Zebras are playing against them. Let's just be honest.
That's true. But Miami has all the momentum at this point. They're up 7. OSU has to score a touchdown on this drive to keep the game going. And after a 5-yard run, a false start, a sack, and an incompletion, it's 4th and 14. It's looking like OSU's magical horseshoe up the ass run is about to end, and we have a clip showing what happened on that 4th and 14. It's at 2:28:30 on the video.
You've got 2 protectors back there for Quinzel. Now one of them runs away, Clarett. Quinzel steps up and goes to the sidelines, and that's good for a first down. Caught by Michael Jenkins.
This is actually one of the most underrated plays of the entire game. Nobody ever really mentions it, just in the kind of just anybody in history of who's ever watched this game. Nobody ever mentions that play. Think about that. 4th and 14. All right. We have Miami. I said we. Miami has the momentum. Basically, all they have to do is just get a stop here. And what ends up happening? Michael Jenkins on the sideline basically was able to just catch the ball and just get out of bounds. I mean, Sean Taylor was like literally maybe 3 or 4 yards away from him, but I think he was more concerned with the guy running the inner route.
Well, if you watch the play, Craig Krenzel was kind of rushed out of the pocket. I think Miami's D set up something more of a rush than a coverage type play.
Yeah.
Thinking 4th and 14, even if they play them deep, play for the tackle rather than play for the incompletion, right?
Yeah, but I mean, this was a backbreaking play. So Ohio State gets a fresh set of downs, are able to move the ball to the 5-yard line. Now, on 4th and 3, it inevitably sets up the most controversial play of the game.
Yeah, and if you're following along on the YouTube video that we prefaced earlier, the timestamp on it is 2:32:41. Again, it is 24-17 Hurricanes, 4th and 3 Buckeyes, first overtime. This is the do-or-die play. They've got to convert this either first down or a touchdown to keep the game going.
There is Hartsock right there.
Claret's up there as a wide out too. The ball goes into the end zone, and it is incomplete. Intended for Gamble.
Now, what's happening after that particular soundbite is chaos.
Yeah, exactly. At that exact moment, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking, back-to-back champions.
Exactly.
Everybody's running out on the field. You can hear some of the fireworks going off, and
us OSU fans were thinking, it's like, okay, we did not actually think we were going to beat the Miami Hurricanes going into this game. We had a great season. The fact that we got to 13-0 is a miracle in and of itself, given how many close games there were in this season. But of course, as the great Lee Corso has said way too many times, not so fast, my friend.
Now there is a penalty flag thrown.
Hold on.
Hold the phone. Everybody comes running down on the field. You got to get off because there's a penalty flag thrown, and I think it's against Miami.
And if it's thrown in the end zone, the ball will be placed on the 1-yard line. 1st and goal.
Glenn Sharp trying to cover Chris Gamble, and he may have arrived a tad too soon. Randy Crystal.
And yes, Ohio State is still alive. After a pause pregnant enough to make an expectant mother of quintuplets jealous, the legendary pass interference flag is thrown. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Do not collect your second straight Waterford Crystal football. Go directly to the 2-yard line to try and stop OSU's offense for 4 more plays.
It's been a while since I've actually seen that play. I remember just feeling just the same way I felt when I initially watched it. Just like, it's just a bad call.
Hold
on. It's just a bad call because, I mean, let's be honest. In that particular part of the field, Glenn Sharp did nothing particularly wrong. I mean, yeah, guys are putting their hands on him, but he didn't hold him. He didn't hook him. He didn't grab anything. And as you could see, Chris Gamble, the ball is already kind of fumbling from his hands. Like, he has a chance to make a play. Oh, hold on. I'll give you a chance. He has a chance to make a play on the ball before Sharp even really gets any kind of hand on him. He bobbles it before Glenn Sharp actually hooks him, and then I guess he kind of goes for the face mask a little bit, but not without grabbing it. By that point in time, Gamble has already lost the quote-unquote battle of getting to the ball.
You see, my interpretation of this is a little bit different, right? I think Glenn Sharp kind of turned Chris Campbell's body a little bit to where him being able to make the play on the ball wasn't able to be done at that point. And by the letter of the law, that is pass interference.
I disagree. I disagree on that because, I mean, it's look, I guess it's a 50-50 call. Obviously, me being a Miami fan, you being an OSU fan, it just looks like a bad bad call. I mean, it's just there's nothing that warranted that flag. And I'm look at it. My voice sounds a little passionate right now.
I would disagree with you on that one.
Bringing up a lot of old memories. It's just there's nothing that there wasn't any kind of hold. There wasn't any kind of he didn't kind of just hold his hands or just locked his arms or anything.
Did he make
gave him a
contact
chance
with him trying to make a play or not?
Not significant enough contact to warrant
By
that
the
flag.
letter of the law, was it pass interference?
Is it a 50-50 call on your part?
Plus side of 50, yes.
Take it by so okay. So you can admit it's a judgment call.
Oh, yeah. Pass interference is almost always a judgment call, but I'm saying by the letter of the law, it was pass interference.
The way I look at it, Gamble had a chance with his hands free to make a play on the pass. He did not make that play before any significant contact from Sharp happened. I'm going to stand by that till I'm in my grave.
All right. Well, you say tomato, I say pimp. That's from an episode of Burn Notice, by the way. But also on that play, something that not a lot of people tend to point out, the defensive back covering Michael Jenkins could also have been called for holding. And that's something that kind of gets lost in the shuffle in all this, right? But again, that official didn't throw his flag at all. And that speaks to a kind of a running theme that's been through this game so far, the very subjective nature of officiating, as was the case back in football in 2002 and 2003.
Correct. And, be that as it may, the call happened.
Yeah. So
Ohio State gets the ball on the 1 yard line.
Yeah. And after two stops, it's 3rd and goal from the 1. And given Miami's defensive front, it's not looking like it's any kind of guarantee. But Ohio State's leading rusher for this game, Craig Krenzel, that's right, the would-be microbiologist, ends up scoring on a QB sneak after they had tried the same play the play before.
That was a ballsy call by Tressel. Again, that was a very, very ballsy call. You have Clorette in the backfield. You try to run this kind of sneak. It didn't work. You think like, okay, let's try to come up with some elaborate kind of plan just to get into the end zone. Oh, just give the ball to Clorette. They run the same exact play, and this time Krenzel gets in, which ultimately ties the game at 24-24.
Yeah, and think about it, right? Say this Krenzel play doesn't work, or they call something else with Clorette in the backfield. That could have been Jim Tressel's, Pete Carroll, Marshawn Lynch moment. And Ohio State fans are forever grateful that wasn't the case.
Or his Pete Carroll, Reggie Bush moment. Let's not forget in the 06 Rose Bowl, he had Lendell White, I guess it was on a 4th and 1. Right. He has Reggie Bush, the Heisman Trophy winner, on the sideline. Not even as a decoy, but on the sideline. What do you think Texas's front is going to, what do you think kind of play that they're gonna
especially
call?
with a big guy like Lendale White, who's designed for those sorts of plays on 4th and 1.
Well, I guess, yes, Glendale White should have probably gotten converted that, but how do you have the most exciting player in college football, not even as a decoy? I mean, just think about if he's able to take 1 or 2 guys away from that particular play, but that's a whole nother game. So Ohio State does convert, which, again, sets up second overtime, 24-24.
Yeah, it's 24-24. After a 9-yard run, a stop, a Krenzel sneak for a first down, and a 6-yard completion to Jenkins, again, with them having just been on the field the series beforehand, Clorette scores a 5-yard TD to put OSU up 31-24. Now, an interesting note for the game, as dominant as Clorette had been throughout the regular season, he only had 47 attempts on 23 yards. He averaged less than 2 yards a carry for the game, but he had the 2 big TDs and the forced fumble that we talked about on Sean Taylor, once again proving, as we've seen way too many times in football, that the stat sheet doesn't tell the whole story.
Yeah, he made the impact when he needed to. Obviously, those 2 big touchdowns, and obviously the Sean Taylor strip. I mean, he made the big plays when he needed to, and sometimes, again, stats don't, they don't paint the picture of what kind of game that you play. You even look at Krenzel; he passed for under 100 yards, but still, he was the most dynamic player offensively. Not just for Ohio State, but he made the biggest plays.
And he rushed for 81 yards in that game, which if you would have told any Ohio State fan Craig Krenzel is going to outrush Maurice Claret in the national championship game, any one of them would have looked at you like you had deer antlers coming out of your head.
Yeah. So heading into the second overtime.
Or at least Miami's possession on the second overtime.
Yes.
OSU's up 31-24. It's 4th and goal from the 1. Now Miami is in the do-or-die scenario, as Ohio State had been twice before in this game. And if you skip ahead on your YouTube video to the 2:51:40 mark, again, Miami had gotten down the ball down to the 1, and here's the play.
It is 4th down, the final play, unless they can stick it in the end zone. Andre Johnson, Roscoe Parrish, and Kellen Winslow, and Dorsey under pressure, throws it, incomplete. The Buckeyes win.
You hear that?
C. Grant was the man who pressured Dorsey, and now the party begins for the Ohio State Buckeyes. They are 14-0. And they are the national champions of college football.
Yeah, as soon as I saw Grant rush from that edge, and I pretty much knew that play was dead in the water. I mean, Dorsey had no time. Essentially, he was, I guess, looking for Andre Johnson. But again, in that particular moment, once I saw Grant, that free rush that he had at Dorsey, I was just like, that's all she wrote.
Hearing the words "the Buckeyes are the national champions" come out of the mouth of the legendary Keith Jackson is like music to any Ohio State fan's ears. Like that is like Jesus speaking to you on Easter Sunday. But interestingly enough, a lot of people would say Miami shouldn't have even been in that position to begin with. You know, Dorsey missed a wide open throw on second down.
Yeah, he did. And again, it's just when I spoke earlier about this Dorsey just not ever finding a rhythm. I mean, he could do no wrong the year before against Nebraska in the Rose Bowl. I mean, he was just hitting everybody. He was a bit off. I mean, outside of really Kellen Winslow, he never really kind of felt comfortable with any of our receivers, any of our, just like anybody on the field. It's just like he just looked like he was just struggling the entire game.
Well, I think that's also a testament to Ohio State's defense, too.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Dustin Fox played really well, and he's kind of like the guy nobody ever paid attention to because you had, you know, your Will Allens and Mike Dawsons of the world. And Ohio State ends up winning the 2002 national championship when going into the season, nobody really thought that team was going to do much of anything.
And they're the first team to ever go 14-0 in college football history. You know what? Looking back on it now, it's a testament to their will, a testament to the heart of the players, you know, not just having that just never give up mentality. Obviously, they had a few games that they had to squeak by, but still, a win is a win. You know, I have a lot of respect for that Ohio State team. Is anybody going to suddenly remember them as one of the great college football teams?
Oh, God, no. God, no.
No, but I mean, they did something that had never been done before, and they beat everybody they had to beat. They had to go to Ann Arbor and beat Michigan. You know,
that game was in Columbus.
Oh, was it in Columbus?
No, the first time they beat Michigan under Tressel was in Ann Arbor.
Okay.
That was a 1.
Okay, so that, and then they obviously took out the best team in the country. Again, Miami team that had a 34-game win streak,
was an 11.5-point favorite.
You know, had some All-Americans and future Hall of Famers on that team, and they did what they had to do. So, you know, just a lot of credit to Ohio State.
And to add to that, I think it speaks a lot to the coaching, right? And that would kind of manifest itself in the years following this game, right?
Yeah.
Because if you take a look at where Ohio State ended up over the course of the next decade and even beyond that, under Tressel, right? They went from being kind of like the second or third biggest Big Ten team around the turn of the century to where by, 2005, 2006, 2007, they were a perennial national championship contender. Right, they were number 5 going into the game against Michigan that they lost when Michigan had Chris Perry. But then they don't lose to Michigan again under Tressel. And actually, other than the 2011 year when Michigan had Brady Hoke, Ohio State hasn't lost to Michigan since.
Yeah, it's been a very one-sided rivalry. If you even want to call it a rivalry at this point.
I mean, no, it's still a rivalry. I mean, we've beaten them 15 out of the last 16 years. It's still a rivalry. That's still Christmas morning for Buckeye fans everywhere.
Well, I mean, with that being said, it unfortunately sent the UM program, not initially, but you could kind of see the downward spiral as a majority of Brady, I'm sorry, not Brady, but Butch Davis's players went on to the NFL. Basically, it exposed Larry Coker as just not being a good recruiter and B, a good in-game coach. The program, about maybe after another 2-3 years, just really kind of fell on hard times and has kind of been looking for its identity ever since. And we're talking about like a decade. I mean, this game happened in 2003. I mean, think about that. Think about Miami not being relevant in college football for 17 years.
Yeah, Larry Coker got exposed, and they did have some good players. Greg Olson obviously ended up being a great tight end for them. But then the Randy Shannon years came in, then the Al Golden years. Then
Mark Richter was, I mean, he had a kind of a glimmer of hope for like about a month.
He got them to a New Year's Six game a few years back.
Yeah,
against Wisconsin. Granted, they got slaughtered, but still.
I mean, it's just never been that consistency, and that's what we look for. I mean, you look how Ohio State was able to go from Tressel to Urban Meyer. And basically, Urban Meyer's first year, they were on probation, weren't they?
Yeah, they went 12-0.
And 12-0. And then
they weren't even eligible.
Exactly. And basically, you just look for that consistency in a program. And, in what I consider, well, look, anybody would consider Miami a 5-star program has been irrelevant since. And they've never really been able to put the pieces back together. And it really started from that particular game. And I mean, it was slowly but surely from that game.
And if you think about the Big East that Miami was in at the time, of course, it was not laden with powers. Sure, you had a good Virginia Tech team that had Michael Vick a couple of years earlier, and Syracuse had Donovan McNabb a number of years back. Pitt had Larry Fitzgerald, but they didn't have the traditional powers that were good year in and year out. And now they're in the ACC, and they're very much in the same scenario.
And they actually ended up going to the ACC the very next year.
That's right, the 2004 season.
Yeah. 2003 season.
No, they left for the ACC in 2004.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, it's just one program was able to sustain their, greatness in Ohio State. And one program is looking for their identity and has been since January of 2003. With that in closing, let me just get your perspective on this game in just a complete nutshell.
It was a very transitional game for both programs, right? In opposite directions, like we just said. Should Ohio State have won this game? I know some people are going to say no because of the various, officiating calls and non-calls that happened. But Ohio State did what they needed to do under the paradigm of what 2002 college football was to win a national championship.
Agreed. And it just still amazes me. Again, these are things that you don't think about. Just like how just Miami is just it's irrelevant. I mean, it's sad when you think about it.
Well, hopefully, for you, the 2020 college football season will change that. Of course, that's still
up in the air.
It's still several months away, and we don't exactly know what that's going to look like. And, we don't know what the sports world, as we said earlier, is going to look like over the next few months anyway. So if you have any good ideas for topics you want us to cover, maybe a team, maybe a particular game, maybe something completely off the wall, feel free to email us at reggienregispodcast at gmail.com. That's REGGRE, the letter N, REGIS, podcast at gmail.com. Feel free to follow us on Twitter. That's Reggie N Regis Pod. I understand that we are now up on some other platforms as well.
Oh, yeah. So we are up on Anchor. We're up on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Breaker. Just check us out. Whenever you can on there as well. And obviously we're up on YouTube. So just look for Reggie N Regis Podcast. Look for our Twitter page on Twitter, and just I guess in closing, any final words?
This is a great game to go over.
Yeah,
hopefully,
we finally were able to cover it, which is good.
Yeah, we actually when we first met last summer, like I said, this was our idea for our first episode to be, of course, until the sports world stepped in and dictated otherwise. But like I said, if you have any other ideas, let us know what you think of the show. Let us know if there's anything you want us to cover. And we will be back with you guys next week with a topic to be determined. I'm sure we'll come up with something.
Yeah. So my name is Reggie Bobrin.
I am Regis. Thank you for listening.
And we are